In the heart of a glittering seaside restaurant, the clinking of fine glassware and murmurs of wealth filled the air. But in one corner, the atmosphere was different, quietly charged, almost electric. A young black waitress stood frozen, her hands trembling as she realized who she was serving. The elderly woman before her, draped in red and pearls, wasn't just any guest. She was the grandmother of a powerful millionaire. Yet something was off. The woman didn't respond to greetings, her eyes scanning faces but missing words entirely. What started as a routine service was about to unravel into a moment that would expose secrets buried beneath years of privilege, silence, and unseen prejudice. No one in that room would ever forget what happened next. The morning had started like any other for Amara, a young waitress who'd learned to move with quiet precision through the luxury restaurant where the city's elite came to be seen. The place was a world of crystal chandeliers, ocean views, and voices that carried the scent of money and entitlement. Amara had worked there for 3 years, long enough to understand that people noticed her only when they wanted something. Her dark skin, polite smile, and steady posture made her invisible and visible all at once. It was a balance she'd perfected out of necessity, not choice. That afternoon, a private reservation had been made under the name of the Kingsley family. The staff whispered about them: old money, powerful influence, a dynasty that stretched back generations. Amara was assigned to serve their table. She prepared with meticulous care, checking every fork, every glass, every fold in the napkin. Perfection was her shield against the small indignities that often came her way. When they arrived, she immediately recognized the family resemblance. The matriarch entered first, a woman with silver-gray hair, wearing a red suit that radiated both wealth and authority. She moved slowly but deliberately, her eyes sharp despite the hearing aids tucked discreetly behind her ears. The staff had been warned she was deaf, yet the room seemed to speak around her rather than to her. Behind her came her grandson, Donovan Kingsley, a young millionaire whose face had graced magazine covers and business blogs. He carried himself like someone accustomed to command, but weary of it. As Amara approached the table, she sensed something beneath the surface, an old story lingering between these people. The grandmother's silence wasn't just about her deafness. It was a fortress. And when Amara placed the first glass of water before her, a flicker of recognition crossed the old woman's eyes, something sharp, almost fearful. That fleeting moment marked the beginning of a chain of events that would expose a secret neither of them knew they shared. As Amara approached the table, she steadied her breath, clutching the tray against her chest. The hum of the restaurant faded into the background, replaced by the quiet pulse of her own heartbeat. She smiled and set the first plate down gently, aware that every motion was being silently evaluated. The grandmother's eyes followed her, sharp and unblinking. It wasn't hostility at first, just scrutiny. The kind that came from a lifetime of being served rather than serving. Amara noticed how Donovan spoke to his grandmother. Slowly, with clear enunciation, his words accompanied by gestures that hinted at familiarity with sign language. The old woman nodded sparingly, but her attention kept drifting back to Amara, as if she were searching for something beyond the food, beyond the surface of service. There was a flicker in her gaze, a question, a memory struggling to rise. Throughout the meal, small things began to shift. When Amara reached for a napkin that had slipped, the grandmother flinched, startled, then turned away, her face tightening with discomfort. Later, as Amara poured the tea, the older woman's hands trembled, spilling a few drops onto the tablecloth. Donovan leaned forward, concerned, but she waved him off, her eyes fixed on the waitress once again. It was as if every movement Amara made carried an echo of something long forgotten, something that made the old woman uneasy. In the kitchen, the whispers began. The staff noticed the tension and exchanged knowing glances. Some assumed the grandmother was simply another entitled customer. But Amara felt something deeper, something unspoken that lingered between them. When she returned with dessert, the grandmother motioned for her to come closer, her frail hand trembling slightly. She pointed at Amara's wrist, where a tiny birthmark in the shape of a crescent moon peeked from under her sleeve. The woman's face went pale. Her eyes widened, not in recognition of a stranger, but in shock, as if she'd seen a ghost from a past she'd buried. The moment stretched thin. Donovan noticed the change but couldn't grasp its cause. The grandmother looked at Amara with a mix of horror and sorrow, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words, or perhaps didn't have the courage to. Amara stepped back, unsure if she'd done something wrong, the weight of invisible history pressing down on both of them. The hum of wealth and laughter in the restaurant continued, oblivious to the silent storm that had just begun to form. The evening had deepened, the glow of the setting sun painting gold across the glass walls of the restaurant. Laughter and chatter flowed from other tables, but at the Kingsley's corner, silence pressed like a heavy curtain. The grandmother sat motionless, her teacup untouched, her pale eyes fixed on Amara with an intensity that made the young woman's pulse quicken. Donovan glanced between them, confusion clouding his expression. Yet neither woman broke the moment. Then, with trembling hands, the grandmother reached into her handbag and withdrew a small, aged photograph. The paper was worn, edges curled, colors faded by time. She slid it slowly across the table toward Amara. The waitress hesitated, then looked down, and her breath caught. The photograph showed a young black woman holding a baby, standing beside a mansion that mirrored the very house Donovan had once shown off in magazines. The woman in the photo looked eerily like her mother. Amara's hands began to shake. Her mind spun through the fragments of stories her late mother had whispered, of working as a housekeeper for a wealthy family, of a secret she could never speak aloud, of a promise to protect her child from a world that would not understand. The truth hit her like a wave. The deaf grandmother, seated before her, was not just a stranger from a world of privilege. She was her blood, her mother's mother. The woman who had cast her daughter out decades ago for falling in love with a black man. The grandmother's face crumpled as tears welled in her eyes. She mouthed words Amara could barely piece together, "Forgive me." Her hands trembled in silent apology. Decades of pride, prejudice, and guilt seemed to collapse in that moment. Amara felt torn between rage and sorrow, between the generations of pain that had shaped her life and the frail woman before, her who had finally recognized her humanity. Donovan's confusion turned to disbelief as he read his grandmother's lips and saw the photograph. He understood, too late, that the woman who had served them with quiet dignity was family. The secret his grandmother had buried to protect her reputation had returned in human form, standing tall in a waitress's uniform, carrying the weight of generations unacknowledged. For a long moment, no one moved. The restaurant continued around them, music, laughter, the clinking of cutlery, but at that table, time stood still. Two women, divided by race, history, and silence, stared at one another across the gulf of everything that had been lost. The silence at the Kingsley table lingered long after the truth surfaced. The photograph lay between them, a fragile bridge connecting decades of pain and denial. Amara stood still, her hands trembling, unsure whether to stay or walk away. The grandmother's tears fell freely now, silent, unrestrained, her body shaking with the weight of unspoken regret. For years, she had buried her past under the armor of wealth and reputation, convincing herself that silence was protection. But in the quiet language of the deaf, silence can also be punishment, and that truth now sat heavy in the air. Donovan rose slowly, his expression torn between shock and shame. The man who had built his empire on confidence and control suddenly looked small, his privilege stripped bare. He glanced at his grandmother, then at Amara, realizing that the divisions his family had upheld for generations had built the very walls separating them now. The room seemed to shrink, the chatter fading to a distant hum as he reached for the photograph. His voice broke in a whisper only his grandmother could read on his lips. "What did we do?" Amara finally spoke, her voice calm but trembling. She thanked them both for their time and stepped back, reclaiming the quiet dignity that had always been hers, even when others failed to see it. In that moment, she carried more than the legacy of pain. She carried survival, resilience, and truth. The grandmother reached out a shaking hand, but Amara didn't move closer. Some distances, she knew, could not be crossed in a single evening. As the night drew to a close, Amara walked out into the cool sea air. The waves whispered against the shore, steady and unbothered by human frailty. Behind her, the restaurant lights glowed like distant stars, indifferent yet beautiful. She breathed deeply, the salt and wind clearing her thoughts. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about refusing to let inherited hate define the future. Somewhere in the darkness, she hoped the grandmother would understand that too. For the Kingsleys, that night became legend, a story whispered through their halls, a secret that no amount of money could erase. And for Amara, it was freedom, proof that truth, once revealed, cannot be silenced. In the end, it wasn't wealth or power that mattered, but recognition, the moment when two generations finally saw each other, stripped of titles, color, and pride, because sometimes the loudest lessons are spoken in silence.